Thank you for joining the Specialty Pharma and Evolving Trends panel. I first wanted to thank Craig and Zubin for putting this together. It was really their brainchild to come up with this conference, and I found the morning valuable, and I hope you're enjoying it overall. I also wanted to thank Patrick Heron, my co-leader in this panel, and all the conversations we had leading up to it. So thank you, Patrick, for everything you've done so far, too. So not unlike other areas of healthcare, specialty pharma has certainly evolved over the last decade. We've seen emerging trends from what were more commercially focused businesses to more vertically integrated companies and companies that have diversified the platforms. So today we're going to look at how these companies have evolved, take a short, very brief look at that evolution, but also focus on where we are today and where the business is going. So with that, I'd appreciate it if our panelists could go through their backgrounds. Declan, can you lead us off, please?
Sure, happy to do it.
If I can say, Declan Quirke is one of the leading bankers in this area. He and I have worked together on multiple transactions at his prior firm and at Stifel. And I think he's someone people have known as being one of the leaders on the M&A side in specialty pharma.
Wow, that's a lofty introduction. Thank you. So I run our healthcare investment banking group at Stifel. I've been there 2.5 years. Before that, I spent a decade at Cowen and then a decade at Payne Weber. Pretty much all life science, pretty much all M&A.
Great. And Bhaskar is with us today, and he brings a great wealth of experience on the development and commercialization side. And Bhaskar, could you talk about your background?
Thank you. So I come more from the operating side. About a year back, I switched over to the dark side and joined Frazier. So I'll let Patrick give an introduction to Frazier. But for me, I have been with Valeant just before joining Frazier. And prior to that, a company called Dow Pharmaceuticals, and then before that, Mylan Pharmaceuticals.
So I'm the dark side. I've been at Frazier 14 years. Prior to that, I was at McKinsey. I spend probably about a third of my time doing specialty pharmaceutical revenue stage companies, both profitable and unprofitable, and looking forward to the panel.
Great. And Martin comes, I think he's one of the most popular people at healthcare cocktail parties now, given that he's at Marwood, and maybe you could talk about a little bit of what you're doing there in addition to your background.
Great, thanks. I lead a lot of our engagements with Marwood with private equity sponsors or healthcare companies that are looking to invest in the space. We do regulatory reimbursement work for them in the specialty pharmacy area, really focusing mostly on commercial payers, what they're thinking about the specialty pharmacy area, what it's going to mean, as well as some companies and how they should approach companies.
Great. And then a man that needs no introduction in the specialty pharma world, Sam Katz, who Sam Sachs, who has been very involved in building companies and then also advising them from a board role, consulting role, and really bringing great therapeutics to market. Sam.
Yeah, I'm a physician oncologist, started in the first oncology group at Genentech before they had any products. Spent a decade at Alza, transforming it to a product sales-driven company. Ran it for a little while for J&J, and then was involved with some of my colleagues in forming Jazz Pharmaceuticals in the last decade. I'm now a consultant to a variety of specialty pharma companies, and I'm on the board of a number of them as well.
And so Sam, as one of the leaders in this area, how do you define specialty pharma? Because I think there's a lot of debate around the model.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought the best description was a market cap description, just because people put so much hodgepodge into the specialty pharma world that there's really no unifying principle other than market cap. So, I generally think of it as companies in 500 million to kind of 3-4 billion kind of market cap range, and it doesn't matter what you do. If you're in that range, you're going to get called specialty pharma.
And Declan, as someone representing the buyers and the sellers, how would you define the category?
So I tend to agree with Sam. I think the term has morphed over the years. Specialty pharma, I think, used to be at one stage defined as people that were not promoting products to primary care sales force, with a primary care sales force. And maybe that's still true. I think, and maybe it speaks to the market cap issue, specialty pharma at one stage was people who had commercial product and didn't do much in the way of R&D, so the sort of buy and build strategy. I think at certain stages, folks in the specialty pharma space became interested in orphan diseases. Now we're starting to see guys like BMS, who would claim to be the largest specialty pharma company on the planet. So you're starting to see pharma move towards this specialty pharma label. I'm not really sure what it means. I know that within our investment bank, we have 4 research analysts covering life science. One allegedly covers specialty pharma. But if you look at her universe of covered companies, you could actually take some of those and put them in the life science research analyst space and vice versa. So I'm not really sure it means all that much. You typically, investors don't say I'm a specialty pharma, in the public markets, don't say I'm a specialty pharma investor or I'm a non-specialty pharma investor. I think you do see the venture and private equity guys make that distinction. But I think it's an amorphous term, and I think often people just use it to suit a certain circumstance or set of criteria at a certain time in space.
Yeah, I think from an investor perspective, the only thing I'd say is that usually we define development stage companies where it's only clinical development more as sort of venture stage, even if they're in specialty indications, and growth equity more as cash flowing or revenue stage companies. And so I think that's the distinction that is applied on private companies more than publics that happens.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. We have that same distinction. I've seen that used pretty consistently across the investing industry. Bhaskar, the evolution of the model, you have really seen it over the years from not only building companies, but being providers to the specialty pharma companies. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen over the last 10 years and how the business has really evolved and changed?
So I'll start 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I joined a company called Pennyderm. It was a small dermatology company. And at that time, we went public, and the analysts defined us as specialty pharma because we had 40 salespeople, and we are hitting the entire derm world with 40 salespeople. So niche indication with a small sales force. So that's how they kind of defined it then. And then, as you know, the whole thing has morphed over a period of time. And today, I think, as you know, Declan pointed out and Patrick pointed out, it's all over the map. But if you look at what it held before, I think the first stages were small companies going after smaller products, developing it themselves, and then going to the market. So in essence, a big pharma, but in one small indication. And right now, I think it's the same thing, only the size has evolved.
Would one of you, and I'm thinking either Declan perhaps or Sam, want to comment on just the diversification and evolution of specialty pharma, how these models have changed? I know certainly having been involved with companies with Patrick at like Precision Dermatology, where they have different verticals. Prometheus had the diagnostics and the therapeutics and the theranostic combination. Would one of you take the lead on that? And then I'd love to hear the other provide some thoughts as well. Sam?
Well, you know, I think the issue now, and Patrick's kind of alluding to this, is the funding of development stage assets. So, you know, once upon a time when we formed Jazz, the idea was we were going to, in parallel, acquire a cash flow positive asset and grow it and develop a commercial organization, but in parallel do a portfolio of R&D with multiple R&D assets. I think, you know, that is really a very difficult road to hoe out, to be able to convince anybody to fund a broad portfolio of R&D assets that's not being funded by your cash flow. So, you know, I think the tendency now is to think of it as acquiring a commercial or soon-to-be commercial product and being cash flow positive, rather than, you know, taking more R&D risk and working more to create the products that you're eventually going to sell. I mean, if you look back at the Alza in the 90s, we spent over $600 million to develop a portfolio of products that, caused us to increase our market cap $10 billion. I'm not sure anybody is going to fund that kind of exercise or that could be funded today. So I think that's a fundamental change. The portfolio aspect of a portfolio of R&D assets is a difficult thing to pull off these days.
And I think the paradox a little bit that exists is, Tom Flynn and I were involved in a company called MidPoint, and this was a buyout of assets from Carter Wallace that we did with Cypress and Carlyle. And it was a real challenge to basically get these guys to accept, from the buyout perspective, that you have to spend money on development. And fundamentally, we ended up doing a bunch of silly deals to try and acquire assets that weren't any good. And the reality was we had some interesting assets that we could develop if we, took the effort to do so. And I think as we, had got in Paul to come in and sort of say, let's make, these combinations happen, let's do that, that's when things started to work. But there's a huge amount of pressure when that cuts into your EBITDA and you're trying to deal with your debt covenants and how you do it. And so I think one of the real challenges now, in order to be successful in this sector, you have to be able to fund development. But how do you do that in dealing with your debt providers? How do you deal with the private equity providers who do not want to, cut into EBITDA? And I think that's a real tension that exists in the market for private companies, particularly today.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that if you look at the recent product launches, they are taking up so much management bandwidth time at the moment because they're underwhelming, to put it mildly. And so until you get your product launch out there and starts to meet expectations, to the extent you're a public company, your stock price is disappointing. To the extent you're a private company, you may have issues with respect to access to additional capital. So actually moving away from your already launched product to start to reinvest in the pipeline is something that boards are kind of reluctant to do. They want you to focus on getting the lead product right. That also translates back into the development stage companies that we also work a lot with, where people are focused on the single shot on goal. If you fail, collapse the company. So there's maybe that's short-termism, I'm not really sure. Maybe it is the owners, venture, private equity guys have portfolios of companies, so they don't actually care if one company fails because they're already diversified. But the ability to take even the capital that you have and invest it aggressively in pipeline assets is somewhat diminished. And so you see, I think, a lot more people going out and looking at more transforming transaction where you buy a company, like Shire TKT, right? Shire was just, I wouldn't say just, Shire was a great company, but it really was just a commercial company without much of a pipeline. TKT totally changed that. If you look at Cephalon, they did the same thing. Some of the most successful specialty pharma companies of size bought pipeline pretty effectively. That's not to say you can't buy it ineffectively. I think more people do that, and I'm in the business of putting companies together, but I think there are more bad transactions out there than there are good transactions, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Bhaskar, you certainly provided development for a lot of these companies as well.
Yeah, one thing, just drawing the continuum between what Sam said and what Declan said, when you think about ALZA, when ALZA started, I remember the tagline, we teach old drugs new tricks. And if you look at it today, how many old drugs are there and how many new tricks can you teach them? So I think the drug development process has changed, FDA has become tougher. The 505(b)(2) approach was one of the best things which people did. Multiple products got approved, but today if you look at it, that is narrowing, and not too many drugs are getting approved by that route. Or even if you are approving drugs with a 505(b) route, I think the cost has gone up astronomically. Absolutely. So I think, the whole development scenario has changed. The number of drugs coming into the market from these smaller specialty pharma companies are a lot lower than what it was before. Sam, when you did ALZA, drug delivery was a big thing then. Right now, look around. There are not too many drug delivery companies or successful drug delivery companies. So I think that's the change. That's the big change which is happening. So, and as Declan pointed out, people don't want to invest in R&D. I was part of Valeant. The biggest motto in Valeant is we are not going to pay for R&D, we are going to buy products late stage. So again, it's a big change.
And now you're outside of Valeant, and how do you view that model? Do you think that model is sustainable over time? And somebody eventually has to do R&D. How do you solve that issue?
See, Personally speaking, I come from the R&D side, so it's difficult to say you can live without R&D. If you think 10 years out, if R&D decreases, where are the new products going to come from? So we have to still sell products. So I think there is going to be a cyclical process where people will start spending money on R&D. At least I hope they will start spending more money on R&D. So no, R&D cannot go away. I think R&D has to come back. So the question is how?
But Bhaskar, is that R&D at Valeant, or does Valeant just continue
No.
to allow others to develop, and if they're successful or look like they're going to be successful, then Valeant can come in?
I'm talking about outside.
Yeah.
Outside. No, Valeant has their own business model, so that's a completely different business model. But Valeant is going to buy products. Where are those products going to come from?
But I would argue to build a specialty pharma company today, the old model of trying to buy an asset, increase the shit out of the price, year after year.
Is that a technical term?
Yeah, it's a technical. There's a particular range you call it, and just it doesn't work anymore, right? And so you have to fundamentally have something else that you're doing in order to build the portfolio to create value, because people will pay you a certain amount for your individual asset, but you have to have the follow-ons to work it through.
Sam, yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to say, people are finding ways to deal with the situation that's being described here. One thing is everybody is being as virtual as long as possible. So a lot of these development assets are being done inside VC shops or with very rudimentary teams. I'm on the board of a company that's launching a phase 3 pivotal program with less than 10 employees. That's not something that historically people tended to do. The other thing is people are looking for, drug delivery in some ways was just a search for exclusivity. I mean, you wanted value added, but you also wanted to protect it. People now are looking at other avenues for exclusivity, and one of the things people are doing is taking assets out of pharma where there's been tremendous sunk cost, and then maybe there's a phase 1 or phase 2 asset that they can instantly go into a proof of concept study. So the ability to de-risk and go into proof of concept as quickly, as cheaply as possible is also something that people are using to work around the current situation. But ultimately, we're still in a situation where if you have an R&D asset that you can successfully commercialize, there's no other activity in specialty pharma that's going to be as valuable as that.
Yeah, I would just comment, Bhaskar talked about he didn't see as many in that R&D side. From the payer perspective, what worries them is that pipeline. They see a bigger pipeline they have in specialty pharmacy in the past. That worries the payers, that worries the employers that are pushing up on them and force them to make decisions. So kind of interesting, a different perspective coming from that way of those who are developing it up and they see it as maybe a little deader landscape than before, and the payers who are just worried about this wave coming pretty much since 2003, MMA, Part D, and all those coverage that they had to do that they didn't have to necessarily before.
It's been a huge challenge, and we are certainly seeing reimbursement and all the diligence time that we're spending prior to going into investments, and then the teams are spending in preparation. I mean, what advice, what are you saying, how are you working with your clients, Martin?
Sure. It's a lot different over the last 5-10 years from their perspective that your P&T committees used to really be focused on brand, generics, more non...
Define a P&T committee.
Yeah.
Pharmaceutical and Therapeutic Committee. So they're... sorry?
Formularies.
Formularies, that's what I say. Coverage. What drugs are we going to cover inside of our plan? And over the last 5-10 years, we've seen a lot more introduction of medical staff to those committees that were primarily pharmacy staff before. So looking at specialty pharmacy drugs, understanding the diagnosis behind it, understanding what it's used for, bringing in the business side, because some of these drugs are so expensive. If you look at hemophilia drugs, they're very expensive. What is it costing our plan to cover them? What types of strategies should we employ as we go through that? So you see a greater focus, more frequency of meetings. They'll have maybe a subcommittee on specialty pharmacy or a subcommittee on technology products that would wrap in these specialty pharmacy drugs, and really thinking about what are we going to do in coverage, and then once we cover it, how are we going to pay for it, how are we going to structure it. And there's an interesting dichotomy between what the plans want to do and what a lot of the employers who obviously influence the decision making. The plans want to cover as many drugs as possible and then not do as favorable pricing or put a preferred specialty pharmacy tier or do some step therapy, a number of things. The employers increasingly don't even want to cover some of these specialty pharmacy drugs. They're afraid of them. They rather a patient go to a patient assistance program or a public assistance program. So it's really creating this push and pull about what are we going to cover at what price and when. And your novel drugs, your orphan drugs, those are going to continue to do well. Some of your ones with competition, the data, the ability to show head-to-head trials is what really going to win over those committees that are trying to make decisions on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think, Declan, when we were having our discussions, you were talking about the challenges of the launch and the public companies. Do you want to talk about that? Because pricing, reimbursement, all of that is folded into it.
Yeah, I suspect that there has been again, I think it's probably the short-termism that we see in the public markets. I suspect there's been too much pressure on companies to launch quickly and start to show scripts, and less of a focus on Martin's area of expertise, which is the whole reimbursement area. And we see this time after time that people are only really addressing formularies and reimbursement 6 months and 12 months after launch. So you might actually expect, and we're starting to see that in many cases these launches plateau and then there's another uptick some period thereafter. Whether they actually ever catch up with expectations, I think is probably doubtful, but that's certainly something that we've seen. I think you can probably blame the sell-side analyst community as well for getting overexcited. So they probably have expectations that would never have been met even if things had been done totally appropriately. And I suppose it's just tough out there, and it's a tough market. It's highly competitive, and we all get a little bit over exuberant on the investment banking and sell side thing when we see something. We're definitely glass half full people, and the glass is probably half full, half empty. The glass was halfway between full and empty. So I think we're seeing those disappointments.
I think one of the challenges we've also seen is just trying to build a company today and getting the assets, as we had talked about it. Large pharmaceutical companies are holding on to them. They don't want to give up the earnings that they're throwing off. You're seeing them trying to sell more or divest or license more clinical stage. Sam, can you help us think through how to build a specialty pharma company today if you were starting de novo?
Well, I mean, for one thing, all these failed launches are going to create some opportunities. I would remind people that when we bought Orphan Medical, which was the innovator for Xyrem, it was a $150 million purchase of a company that had a $19 million product that had been on the market for 3 years. So, it was appreciating that the product was extremely unique. There's nothing else like it at all. And that a very small percentage of the narcoleptics were on the drug compared to what really should have been on the drug given the profile and what it does for people. So, I think a lot of these failed launches are going to create opportunities, but you're going to have exclusivity. So a lot of the problems people are facing now with reformulations or combinations of existing drugs, et cetera, is the exclusivity issue. But I think, again, increasingly, people I think are going to require late-stage development assets, because that's what pharma is getting rid of. And you can take a phase 2, I'm on the board of a company that has a phase 2 asset in dermatology that was acquired from big pharma. The mechanism of action is well understood. It's one that, you can get there from here in terms of understanding how it's going to be effective in this dermatologic condition. And because all the tox and preclinical work and early phase 1 and phase 2 dosing in another indication has already been done, you can really start with a really big leg up. Same thing with late stage phase 3 assets, particularly if you're taking them into a new territory that the big pharma hasn't been in before. So I think that's one way. But I think also, again, looking for commercial assets that have the characteristics that Xyrem did. A lot of these companies, they launch the product, and because it doesn't do as well right out of the box as everyone thought, it becomes a self-fulfilling proposition down the drain. If you get a new management team who sees the vision and has some capital that can reinvest and reinvigorate that product, maybe you don't do what you did with Xyrem, but maybe you, again, create the kind of positive cash flow that then can move the company forward.
Patrick, go
I was going to say, how many single product hospital sales force companies are there out there? There's probably 6 or 7 public.
And too many.
Yeah, and they all are calling on the same guys, and they all have one product, and they're all underperforming and disappointing.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of people running around with private equity thinking, wouldn't it be great to roll all that up? Some will do it. They'll have to compete with Valeant, Jazz, and everybody else, but
Yeah.
somebody
And I
will do
think
it.
that's going to be interesting. Optima is the case in point, right?
Exactly.
So they've hired a bank and they're trying to shop themselves single product anti-infective. And the question is, will a private equity group with another company try and go after it?
Yep.
The problem is if Cubist or Valeant wants it, they'll outbid them. So I think that's going to be the challenge in that particular situation. But completely agree from an efficiency perspective, there are way too many companies out there. And I think one of the questions is, should you, as a company, always launch your own asset? Right? Because in a lot of cases, Bhaskar, you guys made the choice. You were at the stage of launching for Dow, and you sold. Why?
If you develop a product, you have to be ready to launch. As a company, you owe it to yourself. If somebody comes and takes you out, that's a different issue. But, from my experience, I can tell you, when people look at companies, or when I was at Valeant, we were looking at companies, we always wanted some sort of revenue. So either revenue or close to revenue is what people look at. So yes, we were ready to sell. We had the whole thing primed up, but Valeant saw an asset and with a $200 million potential, so it was an easy sell to them.
But I think if you are always shopping, you can sell assets even in your sweet spot. At Alza, we developed a product for prostate cancer. We had one of the top 5 urology forces in the industry with Ditropan XL, and we sold the asset to Bayer because they were willing to pay us. They just had the Cipro go off patent, and they needed a urology product. They were going to pay us much more than we thought we could make on the product. It was an easy decision, even though we had an up and running, highly effective franchise.
So what about financing these? We're going to have a panel a little bit later. You find your assets, you're excited about them, you have to source equity, you have to source debt. What creative structures are we seeing, Declan?
So I think there's probably providers of all of the pieces of the capital structure sitting around here. So I guess the first thing to think about is how do you pay for an asset coming out of, assuming you're buying this asset out of big pharma or spec pharma. The old days, of course, it was cash on the barrelhead, walk away with the asset and deal with it. Then structure started to come along where it was contingent payments based on revenue or approval or labels or whatever. And now the sellers don't really care about that for the most part. They care about earnings. So now you've got to, in some way, mimic what they would have otherwise had as either EBITDA or EPS. And so you saw Targeted come out of Eisai, and basically that deal was structured as Eisai being indifferent for the first 3 years in terms of an earnings perspective. You saw Ricotram come out of BMS, exactly the same sort of structure. So more and more, when you approach a seller, you've got to come up and basically say, I'll replicate the cash flows you would otherwise have made, because they're not short of cash. It's all sitting in bank accounts offshore. That what they're short of is P&L. So if you can actually go in and say, I'll replicate or actually enhance your P&L going forward, that starts to get a conversation going. And you go to a bunch of these guys, and they don't even know they have these products. And Valeant, in fact, is the perfect example. They don't know what they have. So you approach Valeant and you say, I want to buy this and this, and they say, okay, do we have it? Yep, you got that through Aton, or you got that through Medicis, or you got that through whatever. And they will say, well, give me 5 times, and you'll say, I can't do 5 times.
5 times revenue.
5 times revenue.
Yeah.
And then you'll start talking about, well, let me see the P&L that those products do, and you'll say, okay, I'll give you that P&L for the first 3 years, and then some payments down the back end. And that's how we're seeing all the discussions going now.
Which is very interesting because it's being flipped, right? What
Yep.
was formerly structured deals where our companies got bought by the large strategics are now coming back to us in terms of structure in order to get the scarcity of assets and to try to get your arms around those quality products.
Yep.
It's a very interesting change in the industry.
And the sources of capital, can be anything from royalty monetization, straightforward equity, venture debt. I mean, everybody's kind of running around selling their wares, but there's plenty of capital to get the deals done. And actually, in many of these cases, when you go and you talk to some of these guys, they're prepared to actually deal with you on a one-on-one, and they don't actually go to a large auction. Now, Ricotram, obviously, and Targeted were large, crazy auctions, And Targetum in specifically was a very weird one. It was a first to finish. I've never seen that. It was a first to finish. Here are the terms on a term sheet.
Yeah.
Whoever gets there first gets it. I've never seen that, but they got it done. Valeant. Recotherm was quite different, but they kind of led you to, this is the kind of deal that we want you to pay. So the capital's there. There are products there that people can do different things with. It goes to, and I don't think in either of those cases this is necessarily the game, but in many cases there's products you can take out and go to the, what was the technical term you used for raising prices? But you can do that a Valeant or a BMS or somebody else can't do because it's your only product. You don't really care about being on the front of the Wall Street Journal as much as they might. So that's available to you, although I'd love to hear Martin's view on whether the Quest Core type activities are available to people as much as they were.
Yeah, so Martin, why don't you talk about some of the challenges with the pricing flexibility of the past?
Sure. So now payers really care about, going back to the prior question we had, which relates to this, the distribution. So they're talking about, going shopping into a single hospital and calling in, seeing if they want their products. They're really looking at the distribution because that's where they can get the best asset. So the drugs that are coming out, can they go through a single large pharmacy or, the Caremarks and the large groups like that who can give them the best price that they're trying to generate for their members so that's affordable for them as well, that they don't have to increase premiums with all the other challenges. So they say, I want a specialty pharmacy, I want to be exclusive, or I want to have a smaller network of pharmacies than I had in the past, and those that can get the distribution agreements from the manufacturers are the ones that are going to win out in the end. Care management, it's nice, adherence is nice, some of them will care about it more than others, but they really want to see where they can get the big discounts because they're just scared about the cost overall in the pipeline coming down later. They're even doing structures on payment where they'll just take a drug class and do a flat rate, and any drug, some drugs may get higher, some may get lower, but that protects them and gives them more predictability as new drugs come in, that it just goes into that class at that price. They have a set structure of what's going on there in the future. So they're less concerned about all the activity that's going on in the development that's going on in the, which company's picking up, which company's selling. It's how's it getting to the pharmacy, how's it getting to the member, and what price can I put on top of that in order to protect myself in the future.
Although, how do you balance the very high pricing in anticipation at launch of that discount?
As a company or as a payer?
As a payer.
As a payer. You can say, look, I'll give you the coverage, but you're going to be on a specialty pharmacy tier. There's arguments whether the high co-payments that would then be associated with that tier are going to restrict people from going to that drug and choose something else. They may say we want the head-to-head data on the comparative effectiveness in order for us to elevate you to a better tier, to better access ways. And there are some drugs they're just going to have to pay for if they're novel and there's no other alternative and the member needs it. It's a lot harder to just say no and not give that coverage for those individuals. They're going to think about the downstream costs of not providing that drug and what could happen to that individual and the additional costs that will come to them if they don't at least cover this high-cost drug. How can we best make sure that it's used for the proper indication, that it's used when it's necessary? We'll do a little more attention as there are refills coming up. Let's get the data. Let's look at the lab tests. Let's be more active in deciding whether we should continue with this drug because it's so high cost as opposed to just saying no.
It's been interesting to see the flood over the last few years into the orphan area of dollars, and also it'll be interesting to watch the next 5 years how reimbursement impacts that area as well, especially as we move into ACOs and more capitated types of environments. You're shaking your head, Sam. Do you want to?
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think that orphan thing is largely a search for rock solid exclusivity. Because if you come up with a new treatment for a rare disease that there's never been a treatment for before, or some aspect of the disease that it's never been adequately treated, you can charge a lot of money, and no one's going to push back because you're not going to tell somebody with a horrible disease that they can't be covered, and maybe they're the secretary of the CEO who's making the health coverage decision, or they're calling the company and saying, how come I can't get this paid for?
Yeah, headline risk.
Exactly.
It's a lot easier, or it's very hard for the plan to end up on the front page. It's a great story that most people pick up. This drug company is not giving me the drug because the cost I've been paying, my premiums for a number of years, and I find out I don't really have the coverage that I thought I did. Part of what's also going to come into this, aside from orphans and others, in 2014, there's going to be the lift of the annual and lifetime limits on essential health benefits for plans. And even though self-insured employers, under ERISA aren't required to have, quote, essential health benefits, the categories that are under that are still going to apply to those lifetime limits, one of them being prescription drugs. So prescription drug categories will have 2014 no annual or lifetime limits. That will obviously change and increase premiums, probably, number one, but also create a lot of concern at the payers about how they're going to deal with that. And the utilization management that I talked about before is the primary way that they'll look at it.
So again, let's try to talk about diversified specialty pharma and those models. Patrick, you've been involved, Frazier's been involved with a number of companies. And so it's a way of tweaking the specialty pharma model to provide better therapeutic alternatives as well as other verticals. Can you talk about that area a bit more?
Well, I think, one of the areas that, playing in the dermatology area, and Jeff Nugent, who founded a company Precision, is here in the audience, that we like that area as it's consumer driven. And there is an aspect of people self-pay that works well there, and people always are going to care about how they look and appearance. And so we've started to explore areas like that where you can see growth, and you've obviously got a natural acquirer with Valeant out there buying all the assets, making it very difficult for the smaller companies to buy assets, but is one that I think people are looking at, and we've got a model on the device side, Zeltiq, it's the same way. The other thing I would say on the novel areas, going after some of the orphan type diseases, Amicus and others, because if we're selling to large pharma or if we're building the specialty pharma companies that we want to sell to that market, you have to have the innovation. And the innovation is primarily driven because of the payers. The pharma is scared incredibly, I won't use the same technical term, about the whole issue of, how are they going to get this reimbursed? And the only way you can win that argument with them usually is by having payer research done and also having true innovation. And so that's pushed a lot of our efforts there into, the orphan disease, oncology, HIV, very, very severe diseases. So in a little bit, we're looking at both ends of the spectrum, consumer medicine, as well as sort of the very severe disease states.
Yeah, I would agree. Sorry, just quickly, I would agree just because we talked about earlier on the head-to-head data. If there's something else that's interchangeable, they're going to want to see the head-to-head data, the comparative effectiveness. Hepatitis drugs they view as very interchangeably. They're not going to concern about the cost. They're concerned about when it's right. IVIG, off-label use indication, is very concerning to them as well. So you get into the rare areas, the more novel, it's going to be harder for the plans to really do anything about it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how something like the new J&J diabetes product is treated, because it's a completely novel mechanism of action. So obviously there's nothing else like it, yet there's a whole range of diabetic therapeutics, a lot of which are generic. So, it's not just that your product is unique in and of its mechanism or its class, it's what else is available for that disease across the board.
And the growing importance of diagnostics, Sam. Particularly in oncology and other areas, the diagnostic area is one where, Martin, it can help identify which patients would best benefit from drugs. It can help identify who has a particular disease. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Sam?
Well, just obviously in oncology, it's revolutionized oncology now, but it really involves understanding the precise mechanism of action of your drug. So if you're Pfizer and you got the AKT drug and you can identify, the 5 or 6% of lung cancer patients who are really going to benefit from that, it's revolutionary. So, I think in oncology, for years and years, we were driven by empiricism. We maybe understood something, okay, it's a DNA intercalator or whatever, but now we're targeting a specific enzyme, a specific protein, some really specific target, Gleevec, and the diagnostics are very valuable there to sort out who should be treated and to evaluate the biological effect as you're treating them.
I think what's interesting about pharmacy area compared to some other, if you want to talk about services, is a lot of payers look commonly to Medicare, Medicaid about how they cover drugs, how they reimburse them. You can't do that as easily in the pharmacy area because the federal government on pricing pretty much does set off an average sale price or set off of an average wholesale price, and there's no comparative effectiveness that they're allowed to do in healthcare reform. You know, there were all those discussions about it, versus the coverage policies that they'll have for how many PT visits you can get, or when you can get an X-ray. You know, if there's multiple procedures, how many times that should happen. You don't get that same direction from the federal government to payers in the pharmacy area, so they have to set a lot of policies themselves in those internal P&T committees, and it just creates a different dynamic for them, and it's much harder for them.
Yeah, I agree. So we've talked about a lot of what's going on in the industry, how it's evolved. Let's talk about some of the challenges that you faced and how you've navigated them, because that's really a critical part. All these companies have bumps in the road. All of them have to take twists and turns. We heard about some examples previously. Bhaskar, do you want to talk about some of the challenges you faced and how your team and board were able to navigate through them?
So, you know, there are three different angles. One is the development risk, the development problems, and I think that's going to be an ongoing issue. Because it's a moving scale with FDA, you really don't know what the FDA wants till you submit the document, and then they'll ask for something more. So that's something that people have to navigate. The commercial risk is something more that I think we dealt with. You know, going back to the 3 or 4 products recently launched and taking a longer time to launch, the potential being lesser than what it was. I think going back to Martin's point, and this is more of a tie-in to all of the things, is the product truly differentiated? If the product is not truly differentiated, you will have that problem no matter what. You know, it's going to be difficult to get reimbursed, but if you can create the concept or the product, whatever it is, and you have a true differentiation, I think it's going to be okay. Specialty pharma, and not all, but in general, specialty pharma deals in that Me Too zone. Many of the products are not, I mean, they have some hooks, but may not have a clear-cut hook. That's where we have a problem with the payers, getting it reimbursed. You know, Patrick talked about dermatology. Dermatology, if you get a product approved, it's immediately tier 3. So when you do your modeling, you go with a tier 3 modeling. If you can substantiate it, you go forward with that. And then tier 2, etc. is, you know, upside. So I think for us, that's kind of how we dealt with it. If we can substantiate a product with a tier 3 modeling, if it looks successful, we would go with it. If not, you just scrap the program.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
And Patrick, as one of the few venture capitalists that have been in the industry as many years as we have together, and no gray hair, how do you get through all the bumps in the road? Because that seems to be where we spend a lot of our time with the teams.
I think, you know, in specialty pharma, I think a lot of the mistakes we've made and I've made is areas where you take, you know, co-promotion deals. Mm-hmm. I mean, MidPoint, we started off, we thought this is a great thing. We'll take a drug Zomig and for migraine, and we're going to promote it, and we're going to do a better job promoting it. And we've got all these plans, and it didn't work. And because we didn't own the product, we couldn't do the things that we needed to do to really make it happen well. And so one of the things I've always believed is you need to control the product. You need to have that ownership. And when it comes time to sell, if you don't own the product, there's no value in it. So you have to be very thoughtful about that. I think the second place, you know, where we've gotten into trouble is just getting over leveraged. And in a situation where you're doing development and products fail and take longer to launch, you know, how do you make sure you have the right capital structure that you just don't get yourself exposed? Mm-hmm. And making sure that you have the right deep pockets. And I think increasingly in this funding environment where the number of venture funds and number of private equity funds are shrinking, it's much more of a challenge to make sure you've got the right funding base, because there will be a lot of mistakes made in the process. Nothing is linear, and if you don't have the right partners at the table, you can get incredible dysfunction. And I think the level of dysfunction that's happening now in private companies is much higher than I've ever seen, and I think that's a worry for going forward, is people who understand that there will be bumps and, you know, that it's not a linear trajectory.
You're seeing it, Declan, as a strategic advisor, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, when we come across a situation, we look firstly at a management team. Anybody that's proven that they have been able to do it and make money for somebody else in the past is somebody we like to bet on. But probably the second thing, and a fast follower, and I'm not even talking about the products yet, but the second thing is looking at a syndicate of private equity or venture funds or investors, all who have the same vision, the same deep pockets, and the same commitment and time frame. And if you have both of them, then you can actually start to look at what is the company actually doing. But absent those two, it's pretty hard to get things done.
Mm-hmm. Agree. Sam, anything to add?
Well, I mean, I would echo the part about the team. Everybody always says they invest in the team, and the team is critically important. But, it's absolutely the case. When we did Jazz, we did very lengthy, we were a team that had been together at Alza. So it's a team of people who had worked together before and been successful before doing things in specialty pharma. We created a detailed plan. We had Bain and KKR and everybody rake it over the coals 10 times and make sure they bought into everything. And guess what? Nothing happened according to plan. Nothing. The first commercial asset we were going to acquire that generated the ability to get the funding didn't come through. Development assets didn't work the way we expected, et cetera, et cetera. So, at the end of the day, nothing ever goes the way you think it's going to go. Even if you're experienced and have a tremendously detailed plan, you got to have the team that can react to whatever happens when it happens.
And so, Sam, what's going to happen? So we've talked about where things were, we talked about where things are. What are your predictions over the next 5 to 10 years? How does this continue to evolve? Well,
so, when you see big pharma move into an area, you probably know the game's over. It's like when KKR did Jazz, people said, oh, the venture game must be over because private equity is now doing venture type things. This quest for orphan drugs, and, people are going to solve the quest core dilemma and these other dilemmas. So the things that people have thought were, in 2003, we were thinking people need to go into these specialty orphan areas. That was a good thought. Today, you're way too late to the game. So, I think where is specialty pharma going to go? It's going to stay highly virtual. It's going to be dependent on, the right people, but it's going to be less focused on buying the commercial asset of interest and trying to get cash flow, sort of what Patrick was saying, and more on finding a clever way to access development and succeeding on the development side.
And Patrick, from the private investor, we can't get out the next day, so we're looking longer term.
Yeah, and I think looking at development stage programs that you ultimately will commercialize. We look at, John Spitznagel did a lot of deals with Declan and with Adele. His last company was focused on a phase 3 asset, Oceana. And, that ultimately, they made the decision not to launch the company when Declan self-sold it to Salix, and I think that was the right answer. So I think you're going to see, we're focused on very much product development for most of our companies that we're going to sell to the logical commercializer. And given that there's now 50, quote unquote, specialty pharma companies out there, they're willing to buy our assets and buy them at good multiples for us. We have to take structured deals, but that's still interesting. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, we will continue to look at commercial stage like Precision, where you can get, build critical mass in a small company with a small sales force and do those deals. But very weary, living through the Cadence experience, which launched a hospital-based product, of how long that takes. And the people who bought Cadence publicly did better than people who were in the Series A round, right? And so I think there's some lessons on the difficulty of commercialization around a single product company that is challenging. And you may be better off buying distressed assets in the public markets, because I do think there will be a lot of distressed assets to build companies in that fashion.
I was going to say, it's interesting, you mentioned Spitznagel and you mentioned Edic. Those are two guys who are real commercial guys with a lot of success. Both of them spent a year looking for commercial assets to buy. Both of them ended up buying development stage assets in Oceana and Durata. So it's very competitive for those kinds of assets, especially if you're starting with just a smart guy with smart backers, money. What gives you the competitive advantage to beat out? And maybe you're not competing with Valeant necessarily for some of those assets, but there's plenty of other guys. So every asset, if we have a commercial asset that we're marketing, there's 20 or 25 calls immediately, and everybody will sign a CDA and everybody will do the work. So there's people lining up, queuing up to look at those assets. So it's so the question to how do you start, especially pharma, I'd go buy something in Ireland. And if you go back to what has changed, both Jazz and Valeant did their offshore, tax efficient structuring.
Yep.
That I would start there. And there's not a lot in Ireland because I've looked. But you've got to go somewhere else and start to build a business there that gives you as a seller a competitive advantage.
Bhaskar, anything else before we?
No, I think I agree with everybody. The only thing I'll add is if you look at specialty pharma, I think the healthcare policy will kind of have a big impact on how specialty pharma moves. And my thoughts are that, again, the choice of the product. If you cannot get it reimbursed, half of the specialty pharma companies will kind of close down. So I think the choice of the product is going to be very important, but it has to be development stage product.
Martin, any final comments?
Sure. I think that the environment of what payers are going to be going through and how they're make decisions is very uncertain to them right now. You have 30 million employees in employer-sponsored coverage that are going to be moving out, and another 25 million employees that are going to be moving in. You have the insurance exchanges that each state may be setting up or the federal government will set up for them, which is very complex. An expansion of Medicaid populations and Medicaid managed care expanding across the states. And then at the same time, you have private exchanges being set up by Aon and Hewitt for some large employers. You're going to have more small businesses that are looking to self-insure than have in the past. And that's just going to create for payers a very different landscape than they saw before. And whether that decision-making gets consolidated at the payer level or it gets decentralized more so at different employers and their needs and what their members' needs is very uncertain for them right now.
Well, I can see Zubeen inching up in the room so let me turn it over to Zubeen, thank the panel, and turn it over to Zubeen to send us to lunch.